So here we are, gathered around a little bit of a chat, a little bit of an extension to the Music at Noon that we've just shared. And I have the great pleasure and privilege to be here with my dear friend Luke Hathaway, who's collaborated with me and with us on this program, and who is a wonderful poet and teacher and a professor of English literature and creative writing at St. Mary's University in Halifax. So thanks so much, Luke, for being with me today and for being with us. And thanks so much for sharing also in the joy and joyful work of this program.
It has been a joy.
So we have a little bit of time here to chat about all manner of things. It's maybe an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about the processes that we've undertaken in terms of exploring this material, this music by Guillaume Dufay, and the tradition of music and texts, in which we've been working and to which we're responding in our way. Also, maybe it's a chance for us to talk a little bit about our story, and mention a little bit of the work that we've done under the banner, let's say, of Anima, of our creative partnership. And so anyway, we have lots of things that we could chat about. It's difficult to know quite where to start, but maybe, if you don't mind, I'll ask you a little question off the bat. I was curious about time, and here we are in our time, and I'm curious about what kinds of things you might notice about, or what kinds of things might occur to you about time when you spend so much of it with works written in a different time.
Mm-hmm. I love the way poetry and music open portals to other times, and those times become so immediate in our experience of the words and the songs of people who lived in them. This beautiful work that you and I and John and Stephen have done in the past few weeks with Dufay, which have brought the world of early music close. In my life as a teacher, I've thought a lot about early texts from various different eras. In my life as a performer, I've performed early texts from various eras, Shakespeare, notably, I grew up, in fact, close to where you are now, a little closer to Stratford, I did, and grew up seeing Shakespeare every year, getting on the school bus and driving through the countryside to go and see Elizabethan theater. So it was, in fact, very much a part of my vernacular education in the farm country outside of Guelph. This mixing of the new and old, and the sense that the works of Shakespeare were not archaisms. They were things that my best friend's mother was performing in the pit orchestra for. Shakespeare was close to me, partly through the accidents of geography then, I suppose, and the language rich and beautiful, and in fact, gave me words for things that my contemporary language didn't. Being a trans man, growing up in rural Southwestern Ontario, for instance. So I think I've often gone to the languages of other times and places or perhaps I didn't go to them. Perhaps I simply found myself in them and then suddenly found there a wellspring of expression.
Isn't it amazing that those springs are very much still flowing? here we are. We had this great fun of spending some time with well, Guillaume Dufay's music, and spending a little bit of time in that repertoire from the 15th century, which repertoire is seldom done, I think, generally, but especially in our area, in our neighborhood. But you know, isn't it amazing how we found there kind of a living, flowing water in a living tradition after all this time.
It's true. I'd be interested to hear you talk a bit about your own discovery of Dufay. You know, I discovered Dufay through you. You know, I've been serving this year, as you know, as a kind of poet mentor for the choral composition lab that's being run this year. Its first iteration by the Amadeus Choir in Toronto, and trying to share with the poets that I'm working with there some great choral works to sort of whet the appetite. I asked various music makers of my acquaintance, including you, for some favorites. And one of the things that you sent along was this particular recording of the Misa C'est la face I parle. How did you discover it, and when?
Well, you know, I discovered it. I discovered Guillaume Dufay's music when I was a student at Laurier, which was, you know, getting to be quite a few moons ago. And I had the great privilege to be in the Baroque ensemble at that time, which was directed by the late great Michael Purvis-Smith. And he, you know, whom you know, and he and Shannon, one of the programs that we did as part of the Baroque ensemble, Michael and Shannon Purvis-Smith had organized a program of Dufay's music. So there we were in sort of 2002, I think, 2002, maybe 2003. And I remember distinctly, I'd never sung this music before. Maybe I'd heard a little bit of it, you know, in the music history survey kind of thing. But there we were preparing a program of music in the same three-voice texture, surrounded by the sounds of the 15th century, really thanks to the instruments from Wilfrid Laurier University's extensive early instrument collection, instruments that were played by students and by Michael and Shannon. Anyway, there we were in an orange lodge somewhere north of Waterloo, which was, you know, this wonderful, quite a wonderful acoustic in there. I wish I could locate it now. But anyways, thanks to that program that Michael and Shannon had put together, that I had my first taste of singing Guillaume Dufay, and indeed of singing any of this music, this whole rich repertoire of music from the 15th century. And I very much caught the bug. So yes, it was really thanks to Michael and Shannon, and thanks to Wilfrid Laurier University's history of, you know, this long-standing relationship of the Faculty of Music with early music and early repertoires, early instruments, the whole sound world, and material of this repertoire. Walter Kemp and Gordon Green, along with you know, other musicologist colleagues from the history of Wilfrid Laurier University's Faculty of Music, Walter and Gordon were both scholars specifically in the area of this music, as it happens. And that's something that I discovered in reading a little bit about this for the purposes of our program. So anyways, thanks to Laurier that I caught the bug of Guillaume Dufay.
You know, I find this repertoire marvelously queer. You know, the three-part harmonies, the sort of quite various conception of what a man's voice sounds like, you know.
Yeah.
That was a revelation to me. And then I realized it's not news at all, you know. I found a book. This sometimes happens to me. Very often I find a book, you know, but this is not Dufay, but you know, an Elizabethan songbook.
Oh yeah.
W.H. Auden, C. Coleman, and Greenberg. You know, I'm certainly not the first one to find, you know, this sort of beautifully queer language in the world of early music, and also in the worlds of sacred music. And that for me was a sort of joyous wellspring tapped, you know, in this new work on Dufay. It was really fun to hear those notes sounded joyfully and pridefully.
Yeah, it is funny, isn't it, that one of the that's a notable feature of some of this, well, of this tradition of poetry, you know, the courtly love poetry, that there's this beautiful weaving together of sacred and secular language and themes and symbolism and musical forms. It's really a seamless interconnection of through the tradition. And this guy, I mentioned that in part because you know there a lot of our exploration was around that ballades, Cela passait pas.
Yes.
And then we referred also to a couple of excerpts from Guillaume Dufay's parody mass on that same piece. So the Missa Cela passait pas, the cantus firmus of which is really the complete tenor of the ballade. And it's interesting, really in the manuscript source, the text of the tenor the indication is strongly there that, in fact, well, two things, that tenor was not texted with the text of the mass, so that it was either perhaps texted with the text of the ballade. So even sung in its first performances with the mass going on around it, and cela passait pas la cause d'aimer, c'est la principale, really along in the mix. And we also know that sometimes it was played by a slide trumpeter. We have some indication from a manuscript source.
So for those in our audience who are unfamiliar with that text, what that means is that there's this secular love story that is woven through the mass, you know, that the sacred and the secular interpenetrate in music and textually. And this happens again, in fact, in another of the works in our program, the Vergine Bella, which is based on a Petrarch sonnet, a sonnet of courtly love that maps very closely and explicitly onto the Marian tradition of worship, or a Marian tradition of worship. I wanted to talk a little more about the courtly love tradition, sort of sound that note, and maybe suggest some of the reasons why it maps so well onto a certain kind of religious impulse, and also onto onto other love stories, I suppose. You know, the courtly love tradition is preeminently the tradition of the love that is for some reason inaccessible. You know, the person who is out of our reach, literally or figuratively, the person who has died, you know, and is on the other side, the person who is far away, the person who is cold to us, you know, the cold mistress or the cold mister, you know. And that inaccessibility in love is partly simply a function of love, you know. We are twain and several, you know, that is part of our human condition. And yet we long for union. And that longing is where we live. And how we live, and you know, the divine also often seems to stand apart from us or far from us, even as there's something in us that suggests that it's also very close at hand. So this, all of this, very well-developed, nuanced, sophisticated language of courtly loves developed by the poets, it becomes a language of expression for the religious life. It also borrows a lot, I think, from the languages of expression of the religious life. I think it's Simone Weil who says that, people become cross when love poets use the language of sort of religious mysticism. But she makes the point that it came from religious mysticism in the first place. This language sort of goes back and back and back, this interpenetration of sacred and secular experiences of love and longing. And then I think, the inaccessible love, which we experience just in love, and which we experience in our relation with the divine, in its various manifestations. It can map quite specifically onto quite specific experiences of the inaccessibility of the beloved. For instance, in queer love. For instance, in time of pandemic, where one isn't supposed to become physically proximate to other human beings, So as history goes on and time unfolds, this language becomes useful to us in new and sometimes unanticipated ways.
Yeah, it's very inspiring. It just brings us back in a way to this phenomenon of the wellspring of this music and this poetry. That there it is. We kind of open the library door and have a look at these volumes from the 15th century, and then we find that they speak right away to us now to our condition, in our reality now. And we can work with them. We can allow that music and poetry maybe to work for us, with us, amongst us now. As we make things together. And I wonder, what do you think? Shall we chat a little bit about some of that making?
Yes.
One of the, and I like, we sometimes use the language of making, makerly or craftspersonly language around that, because I think you and I both value that and think kind of practically and in a crafty kind of way about working with this material. And in fact, there you were in your studio space, in your workshop, really working with the forms and the language and the meter. And could you talk a little bit about some of those, the constraints of the craft and some of the tools, and maybe we'll get to that funny word that we've been exploring in our work, the counter-factum, or counterfeiting.
Mm-hmm. So this is a marvelous maker's tool that you gave me, Dan, or perhaps I already had it and you simply gave me license to use it. I still remember our first ever conversation in the flesh when we met at the Aroma Cafe in Waterloo many moons ago. And you explained to me that there was a thing that had been done at a certain point in time, and we were discussing Bach, and our earliest collaboration together, which involved an exploration of some of Bach's methods and materials, but a tool in the Bach toolkit, or perhaps in the toolkit of Bach's librettists, some known, some unknown, was the counter-factum, the counterfeit, as you described it to me. Pouring new wine into old bottles, contriving new wine for old bottles, the new wine being a new text that could be poured into the old bottle of an extant melody. Now, um, part of my training as a poet was simply writing a lot of doggerel, writing words for silly songs and all of this. Something my grandfather, for instance, delighted to do. It was kind of part of the family culture I was raised in. But I'd never really been given a fiat to consider it a serious tool that I might employ in the making of meaning in a serious and playful way. And it was marvelous to receive that fiat, because I very much like working in this way. I very much like contriving new wine for old bottles. I'm something of a metricist. I often hear a poetic line before I write it. I hear the emphatic patterns, the patterns of syllable emphasis, before I even know what the words will be. There's a way in which I think I compose very much for the ear, sometimes even before I'm composing for the mind, though I don't really believe that the two are separable. I love writing to kind of fill out a metrical pattern. And that is exactly what one does when one tries to produce a new text for an extant melody. And one realizes very quickly how enormously sophisticated is the apparatus of emphasis in music. There's syllabic stress when one writes for the page, but in music, there's also the length of syllables, and there's a host of words that and I don't, to describe the way in which singers embody meaning.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, as you were speaking about some of the metrical quality of the text itself, and I sometimes, as a singer and as teacher of singing, I sometimes think of that as almost its own line in the polyphony of the thing somehow, and that's actually the coming together of the comings together was kind of one of our themes. So maybe this is a way of touching on that theme as well. When two or three are gathered, well, in this program we had three singers bringing together lines of sung, well, and played. It's an instrumental elements too. In the moment of singing and playing, those lines coming together into the counterpoint, but even and your voice through the poetry coming into the counterpoint of that, but also even within each one of those distinct lines, we almost have lines that build that up, almost like each line isn't just a line, it isn't just a thread, it's more like a braid or something,
Yes, I think about that too in language, even language unset, unsung, that element of braiding, of confluence. When we work in the medium of language, we are working in collaboration with all of the language speakers who have come before us, and all of their tones and undertones and overtones are there in the words that we use, and depending on how we set those words in context, we can turn various of those, I'm mixing metaphors here, but I'm braiding metaphors. You can turn various of those strands up or down in the mix if you like. But that's a great part of the joy of working with language.
I mean, well, you know me, I have this nefarious plot, I very much hope that maybe some of our students who may be listening to our conversation and to the program, the process presentation that we just shared, that some of them may catch the bug too, or may get the idea that actually counterfeiting might be something that they might think about doing. So as part of their making, as part hopefully of their coming together in friendships of collaboration, what do you think about counterfeiting as a way of getting to know the repertoire, let's say the text and the music, and maybe also as a way of, we're sort of making friends with the material, as well as a way of making.
I think that's a lovely way of putting it. It is a way of taking, it is a way of understanding. You know, I love the kind of root sense of understanding. To understand something is actually to stand under it, to take it upon your body and your bones, to walk in it and be in it, allow it to assume you. And when we try to take a melody into us so deeply that it will somehow organically express itself again in new words, it's a radical act of understanding. You know, I think there's also a way of seeing it that would style it as a kind of radical act of appropriation, you know, and in some sense it is. So, you know, but I think there's a way of undertaking that labor that thinks of it in terms of palimpsesting rather than terms of erasure, you know, laying another layer on top of the layers that are already there. And for that layer to not be opaque, but rather to be transparent so that all other layers underneath it can show through. And in fact, that's modeled very beautifully in the manuscript page of Dufay that we've included as part of our program notes, which our viewers can find as a PDF that's appended to the YouTube link for our performance. But that manuscript page shows the music for Dufay's ballade, and then behind it the suggestion of other music speaking through from the verso.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's a very helpful image to understand that aspect of. And it's funny, through a process like counterfeiting, so making a counter-factum, there's a creative relationship with the work and a kind of curating that's going on as well, which I just kind of suggest that to our student listeners, you know, that they might, to see what they think about that, you know, that they might see themselves in the light of being makers and being curators also of the repertoire. I find it great, and I love that your language around it is playful, because it really is tremendous fun. So we're allowed. That's another message to our student listeners and viewers, isn't it? We're allowed to have fun.
Oh yes. One of the wonderful things about this work for me is that the work of counterfeiting, of counter-factuming, to make a nonce coinage that shamelessly mixes its languages, is that there's a kind of workman-like pleasure in it. One doesn't need to feel inspired to sit down and try to simply fill out a metrical line. And yet, of course, the amazing thing, as anyone who plays will know, is that one gets inspired in the process of doing this sort of simple workman-like task of trying to fill out a metrical line. I wondered if you might speak a bit, Dan, about why it is so important to you as a singer and performer that we understand what we sing.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's such a guiding curiosity to me in my work as a singer, but also my work as a teacher. So a teacher of singing and you know, an aspiring Alexander Technique teacher. So I'm a teacher trainee in the Alexander Technique, and I'll sort of, I think I'll start there, you know, in terms of responding to your question, because the Alexander Technique has so much to do with how we as human beings organize ourselves in the activities of our living. So much about how we are coordinated into the things that we wish to do. And so if we're taking the activity of our activity as singing, which which is an activity that I undertake so often, and which gets undertaken at the Faculty of Music so often. Then we have that wonderful question, that really rich and sometimes puzzling question of, okay, well, how do we coordinate ourselves as singers in that act of singing? What are its elements? And there are all kinds of ways to approach that, and vocal pedagogy as a discipline, as a practice, very often has thought sort of mechanically, physiologically, anatomically about some of the elements of coordination for singing, the alignment of the vocal tract, and what are the moving parts, and are there tensions that are kind of gumming us up, getting in our way, so we can maybe free up from those extraneous bits of work and come into an easier alignment for singing, that kind of thing. But there's this other ingredient, and this is really to the heart, I think, of the matter. There's this other ingredient, I think, crucial ingredient in singing, which is a wish to communicate and a wish to connect with people. It's kind of interesting, I think you and I have spoken about this before, but sometimes I wonder about, what do we mean by performing? As singers, what is this performing thing that we're up to, and are we performing something? Or anyway, I sometimes find myself uncomfortable with that phrase. It's like, it's not the most natural thing. There may be other phrases, like simply connecting or communicating with the audience or sharing something with the audience, or I really like including the audience in something. Anyway, the activity, the act of singing, I think, really deeply involves and requires for its natural, easy coordination the yen, the urge to communicate and to connect. And so, if we really know what we're saying, what we're singing about, if we know the flavor of the words, if they mean to us, then we'll be able to share them and to include our audience in the experience of them, the delectation of them, really. And that becomes a lot trickier if we don't understand. And that's okay too. Like we can be involved in a process. We are always involved in a process as students. Well, and always as everything, So let's say we don't speak medieval French yet. Let's say we're just learning that. Well, that's fine, but we will be what we sing, what we share to our audience, what we include our audience in, is going to be that sort of stage of our understanding, that moment of our understanding of the work. And the more fully we understand that, the more free we are to share, and the more free we are just basically to coordinate ourselves in this really natural act of singing.
One of the wonderful things for me about singing is that it is so closely tied to memory, and music is so closely tied to memory, and music and the muses, and mnemosiny, there's a tradition there around music and memory and their close affiliation one with the other. And a great way to memorize a poem is to find a setting of it or make one and sing it, and suddenly you know the poem, and you'll remember it for years and years and years, and then you can carry it around with you in your bones, in your blood. And I mean, I often tell my students of poetry that time is the great interpreter. Once you've exhausted all of your other resources of interpretation, you can leave it to time, and eventually you will understand more, better, richer, more complexly that which you carry with you.
I love that. And isn't it amazing how also that, so committing a thing to memory which is really, living into it and allowing it to live like in your flesh. That embodiment turns out to be a kind of a key matter, doesn't it, for music making and poetry making. It's funny, maybe I just kind of mentioned that again for here we are in an online environment where I think we sometimes have to remind ourselves and each other that we're all fleshy and substantial, because so much of our day-to-day now is in just a couple dimensions. And some of that may suggest that we're, in our wordiness, or in this online space, in our sharing of words, that it's somehow abstracted from the matter of our living. But of course, here we are speaking together and singing together, and anyway, so I'm just waxing on that, but I think that's what you're saying about memory and about living into the words that we're making and sharing. Struck me as a nice reminder that we are in 3 dimensions, even in the online space.
What you say about the flesh is perhaps the right segue to the poem by Richard Outram, with which I thought to end. It makes, I think, a nice bookend to the poem by Frances Quarles, with which you began our program in your beautiful reading of it. This is a poem from Richard Outram's collection, Man in Love, which appeared, published by the Porcupine's Quill, nearby you there, in Erin, Ontario, in 1985. The poem is called Gravity. Now, as a level brook that makes its way by seeming indirection through a stand of tangled willows must at length betray the certain inclination of the land, and by erosion at some bends reveal enmeshed those roots whose deep tenacity and thirst sustains their reaching trees, I feel desire's momentum, gathering what might be the burden of the gesture that you made, provocative and secret as the light that for a single burnished instant played about your groin as we prepared for night, wherein, like bright roots married, we may merge, or streams that on immensity converge.
Thanks so much, Luke.
Yeah. Thanks to you too, and to your gathered audiences there at Laurier in the flesh and otherwise.